If you ever come home after midnight again, don't expect this door to open for you. Those were the cold words everyone in the mansion had heard at least once, but no one had ever been brave, or unfortunate, enough to test them. On the outskirts of Dallas stood the massive Hawthorne Estate, a place surrounded by tall iron gates, endless oak trees, and silence so heavy that even the wind seemed afraid to linger. Every employee knew the rules. Meals were served on time. Lights in the main hall dimmed precisely at 10 o'clock. Security reports were delivered every evening without delay. And above all, every member of the household had to be inside before midnight. No exceptions. The owner of the estate, Nathaniel Brooks, was a Korean-American businessman whose name carried influence far beyond the city. Calm, disciplined, and impossible to read, he rarely raised his voice because a quiet command from him was enough to make an entire room obey. The staff respected him, but they also feared the invisible wall he kept around himself. No one knew much about his personal life. No one dared ask. The only person who treated the mansion like a home instead of a workplace was Emily Carter. At 26, she had worked there for nearly 2 years. Unlike the other employees, she greeted every gardener, cook, and security guard with the same warm smile each morning. She remembered birthdays, quietly left homemade cookies in the kitchen after long shifts, and somehow convinced even the oldest groundskeeper to laugh again after losing his wife. She never sought attention, never complained, and never expected kindness in return. Somehow, that made people care about her even more. Nathaniel rarely spoke directly to Emily, yet he always seemed to know where she was. If she skipped lunch because she was helping the elderly housekeeper, an extra meal mysteriously appeared in the staff kitchen. If rain started while she worked outside, someone would silently leave an umbrella near the entrance before she reached the porch. No one questioned who gave those orders. Emily simply assumed the staff looked after one another. Nathaniel never corrected her. Weeks passed with the quiet rhythm of the estate. Every evening Emily finished her duties, wished everyone good night, and left through the east gate to return to her small apartment across town. She always returned the next morning before sunrise, cheerful despite the long commute. Then one Friday, something felt different. Shortly before sunset, Emily received a phone call. She stepped outside the kitchen to answer it, her expression slowly changing from relaxed to deeply concerned. She apologized to the head housekeeper, gathered her things, and hurried away without explaining where she was going. The rest of the evening unfolded as usual. Dinner ended. The last lights were switched off. Security patrols completed their rounds. At exactly 11:55, the front gate remained closed. Midnight arrived. Emily had not returned. Several employees exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. They all knew the rule. They all remembered the warning. Upstairs, Nathaniel stood alone beside the large window overlooking the entrance. His untouched cup of coffee had long gone cold. He checked the driveway once more, then looked at the antique grandfather clock as it echoed 12 slow chimes through the silent mansion. For the first time in years, he did not leave the window. Instead, he remained perfectly still, watching the empty road disappearing into the darkness, as if waiting for someone whose absence disturbed him far more than he was willing to admit. Emily Carter had never imagined that a simple promise could quietly reshape her entire life. Every weekday began before sunrise. She left her modest apartment while the streets were still empty, carrying nothing more than a small canvas bag, a packed lunch, and the determination to earn an honest living. By 6:30 every morning, she was already walking through the east gate of the Hawthorne Estate, greeting the security guards by name before disappearing into another long day of work. The mansion itself looked more like a luxury hotel than a private residence. Marble floors reflected the soft morning light, fresh flowers decorated every hallway, and every detail seemed carefully planned. Yet despite its beauty, there was very little laughter. Inside those walls, employees spoke quietly. Conversation stopped whenever Nathaniel Brooks entered a room. Even seasoned managers straightened their posture the moment they heard his footsteps approaching. Nathaniel rarely needed to remind anyone of the rules because everyone already remembered them. His calm silence carried more weight than anger ever could. Emily was different. She respected the rules as much as everyone else, but she never allowed fear to erase her kindness. Every morning she prepared fresh coffee for the elderly groundskeeper whose arthritis made simple tasks painful. She helped the kitchen staff carry heavy boxes without being asked. She often stayed a few extra minutes after her shift to organize supplies so the night crew would have an easier start. None of those gestures appeared on her job description. She simply believed that small acts of kindness made difficult days feel shorter. What Emily never noticed was that someone quietly noticed everything she did. Nathaniel's office overlooked much of the estate through discreet security monitors placed throughout the property. Although they existed for safety, Nathaniel occasionally found himself watching ordinary moments instead of reviewing reports. He saw Emily helping a frightened new employee learn the routines without making her feel embarrassed. He watched her kneel beside an injured stray dog outside the gate until a veterinarian arrived. One afternoon he noticed her remove her own jacket to wrap around an elderly visitor who had underestimated the cold weather. She expected nothing in return. She simply walked away after making sure the stranger was comfortable. Nathaniel never commented on those moments, but they stayed with him long after each workday ended. The household slowly began noticing subtle changes. The pantry suddenly stocked Emily's favorite herbal tea even though she had never requested it. A broken heater in the staff lounge was repaired within hours after she casually mentioned that the room felt cold during winter mornings. When she worked late organizing inventory, dinner somehow remained warm until she finally had time to eat. Emily thanked her co-workers for their thoughtfulness, believing they had arranged everything together. No one corrected her because no one wanted to explain where those quiet decisions truly came from. By Friday evening the estate settled into its familiar rhythm. Staff members finished their assignments before heading home. Emily changed out of her work apron, tied her hair back, and prepared to leave. Just as she reached the front steps, her phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen, answered immediately, and within seconds the warmth disappeared from her face. Her smile faded into quiet concern. She listened far more than she spoke, nodding silently before whispering, "I'm coming right away." Without returning inside, she hurried toward the front gate, moving faster than anyone had ever seen her walk. The security guard called after her, asking if everything was all right, but she only managed a grateful wave before disappearing into the fading evening light. Hours passed. The mansion became unusually still. Midnight approached 1 minute at a time as the large grandfather clock counted every passing second. Upstairs, Nathaniel attempted to focus on financial reports spread across his desk, but his attention drifted repeatedly toward the security monitor showing the empty driveway. 11:45. 11:52. 11:58. Midnight. The gate remained closed. Nathaniel slowly stood, walked toward the window, and looked into the darkness beyond the estate. For reasons he refused to admit, the silence outside no longer felt peaceful. It felt unsettling. And for the first time in years, the man who could remain perfectly composed during the most difficult negotiations found himself waiting for one employee to come home. Why does a man who trusts no one keep looking at the same empty gate? The question would have sounded impossible to anyone who knew Nathaniel Brooks. For years he had built his reputation on discipline, precision, and absolute emotional control. Every business decision was calculated. Every conversation served a purpose. Every relationship existed within carefully drawn boundaries. Yet as the grandfather clock echoed past midnight, none of those habits seemed capable of quieting the growing unease inside him. Nathaniel remained standing beside the tall window overlooking the estate entrance. The security monitor on his desk displayed the same deserted driveway from 3 different angles. There was nothing unusual to report. No suspicious vehicles. No unexpected visitors. Only an empty road disappearing into the darkness beyond the iron gates. Still, he could not force himself to walk away. Downstairs, the night manager quietly instructed the remaining employees to finish their closing duties. No one dared mention Emily's absence out loud, but everyone noticed it. Her laughter was missing from the kitchen. The staff dining room had one untouched chair. Even the elderly groundskeeper lingered near the entrance longer than usual before finally heading home with a worried expression. The mansion had always been silent after dark, yet tonight the silence felt strangely incomplete. Nathaniel glanced at his watch again. 12:15. He reached for a file on his desk, opened it, then closed it without reading a single page. His attention drifted back to the monitor. After another minute he pressed a button connecting him directly to the security office. "Has Miss Carter returned?" His voice remained calm, almost emotionless. "No, sir," the guard answered immediately. "Would you like us to contact her?" Nathaniel hesitated for only a second. "No. Continue your regular patrol." The line disconnected. It sounded like a simple order, but the security guard exchanged a surprised look with his partner. During the past 3 years, Nathaniel had never once asked about the arrival time of a single employee. Not once. Upstairs, Nathaniel quietly loosened his tie before walking toward the bookshelf lining one wall of his office. Hidden behind a framed photograph rested a small wooden box containing several ordinary objects that meant nothing to anyone else. A thank you note written in neat handwriting. A pressed white flower. A tiny ribbon from a charity fundraiser held months earlier. Every item had one thing in common. Emily had unknowingly left it behind during moments she had already forgotten. Nathaniel had never intended to keep them. The first item had simply remained on his desk one evening after she thanked him for approving new medical equipment for an injured employee. Somehow he never threw it away. Then another memory followed. Then another. Without realizing it, the collection quietly grew. He closed the box immediately, almost embarrassed by his own actions despite being completely alone. "This is becoming ridiculous," he muttered under his breath. Yet the words failed to convince even himself. Outside, light rain began falling across the estate. Tiny droplets struck the stone driveway as distant thunder rolled across the Texas sky. Nathaniel instinctively looked toward the monitor again. Rain. Emily had left without her umbrella. The thought appeared before he could stop it. He remembered seeing it still hanging beside the staff entrance earlier that evening. For someone who prided himself on logic, the realization unsettled him far more than it should have. Across the city, headlights moved through rain-soaked streets while emergency vehicles occasionally passed in the distance. Nathaniel imagined countless ordinary explanations. Heavy traffic. A flat tire. A delayed bus. Perhaps her phone battery had died. Every possibility sounded reasonable, yet none of them eased the strange pressure tightening across his chest. At 12:37, the estate intercom chimed softly. The front security guard reported movement outside the main gate. Nathaniel looked up so quickly that his chair rolled backward across the polished wooden floor. On the monitor, a lone figure slowly approached through the rain carrying a worn canvas bag. Her clothes were damp. Her hair clung to her face. Even through the grainy security camera, Nathaniel recognized her instantly. Emily Carter had finally come home. Relief flashed across his face before disappearing almost as quickly as it had appeared. In its place came something far more dangerous, an emotion he had spent years refusing to acknowledge. Fear had quietly transformed into anger, not because she had broken one of his rules, but because for nearly 40 minutes he had been forced to imagine a world where she might never walk back through. Those gates again. The sound of the front door opening echoed through the mansion like a warning no one wanted to hear. Rainwater dripped from Emily Carter's coat onto the polished marble floor as she quietly stepped inside, breathing heavily from the long walk through the storm. She looked exhausted. Damp strands of hair clung to her face, her shoes were soaked, and her hands trembled slightly from the cold. Before she could remove her coat, every employee in the entrance hall instinctively looked toward the grand staircase. They already knew who was standing there. Nathaniel Brooks descended one step at a time with the same composed expression he wore during high-stakes negotiations. His posture remained perfectly straight, his face unreadable, yet something about his eyes made the entire room feel colder than the rain outside. No one moved. Even the security guards lowered their gaze. Emily looked up, surprised to see him awake. "Mr. Brooks." "I'm sorry," she said softly, immediately noticing the time displayed on the antique clock behind him. "I know I'm late." Nathaniel stopped on the final step, leaving only a few feet between them. For several long seconds he said nothing. His silence weighed heavily on everyone watching. Finally, he spoke in the calm voice that usually meant every word mattered. "What time is it?" Emily glanced at the clock again. 12:38. "And what is the rule?" She swallowed quietly. "Everyone must return before midnight." Another pause followed. "Then explain why you are standing here almost 40 minutes late." Emily lowered her eyes. She opened her mouth to answer but stopped herself. She could have explained everything. She could have described the unexpected phone call, the elderly woman who had collapsed outside a neighborhood pharmacy, the long wait for paramedics to arrive, and the decision to remain until someone from the woman's family reached the hospital. She could have shown the hospital visitor bracelet still tucked inside her pocket. Instead, she simply whispered, "I'm sorry." The answer only deepened the silence. Nathaniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Throughout his career he had dealt with betrayal, deception, and broken agreements. He believed rules existed because excuses were endless. Yet standing before Emily, his frustration came from somewhere entirely different. He had spent nearly 40 minutes imagining possibilities he could not control, and none of them had ended well. "Do you realize," he said quietly, "that every employee in this house is expected to honor the same standards?" Emily nodded. "Yes, sir." "Then why should your situation be treated differently?" She looked directly at him for the first time that night. Her eyes were tired but sincere. "It shouldn't." The answer caught everyone off guard. There was no argument. No attempt to defend herself. No request for sympathy. She accepted responsibility without asking for understanding. That should have ended the conversation. Instead, it made Nathaniel even more unsettled. He wanted her to explain. He wanted a reason strong enough to erase the fear he had experienced. Yet she refused to offer one. "Very well," he said after another long silence. "You will report to my office tomorrow morning before beginning your duties." "Yes, sir." Emily bowed her head politely and started toward the staff corridor. As she passed him, Nathaniel noticed her right sleeve carried a faint reddish-brown stain mixed with rainwater. His eyes narrowed for only a moment. "Emily." She stopped immediately. "Yes?" "Are you injured?" She instinctively looked at her sleeve before gently shaking her head. "No, sir. It's not mine." She offered nothing else before quietly disappearing down the hallway. Nathaniel remained standing in the entrance long after she had gone. Something about that brief answer refused to leave his mind. If the stain was not hers, whose was it? Why had she hidden the truth so carefully? Upstairs, he returned to his office believing his anger would finally settle. Instead, another emotion slowly replaced it, curiosity. For the first time, he realized that the woman he thought he understood might be carrying burdens she had never allowed anyone inside the mansion to see. And somewhere deep inside him, the need to know the truth had already become stronger than his determination to keep his distance. Sometimes the kindest people carry the heaviest secrets because they refuse to let anyone else carry them. Nathaniel Brooks arrived at his office earlier than usual the next morning, but the stack of contracts waiting on his desk remained untouched. His thoughts kept returning to the image of Emily Carter walking through the rain with tired eyes, soaked clothes, and that unexplained stain on her sleeve. He had expected himself to forget about it after a night's sleep. Instead, the questions had only multiplied. At exactly 7:30, there was a gentle knock on the office door. "Come in." Emily entered wearing her freshly pressed uniform, her hair neatly tied back as though nothing unusual had happened the night before. Only the faint shadows beneath her eyes hinted that she had slept very little. She stood quietly before his desk with her hands folded together. "You asked to see me, sir." Nathaniel studied her expression for several seconds. She appeared calm, respectful, and completely prepared to accept whatever consequences awaited her. "Sit down," he said. Emily hesitated before taking the chair opposite him. It was the first time she had ever been invited to sit inside his office. The room felt strangely quiet. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating rows of books and framed certificates, yet neither of them spoke immediately. Finally, Nathaniel broke the silence. "I gave you an opportunity to explain last night." Emily lowered her eyes. "I know. Why didn't you?" She took a slow breath. "Because someone else's privacy mattered more than defending myself." Nathaniel frowned slightly. "Meaning?" Emily reached into her bag and carefully placed a folded hospital visitor bracelet on the desk. Beside it she laid a receipt for emergency medication purchased late the previous evening. "On my way home, I found an elderly woman collapsed outside a neighborhood pharmacy. She was alone. Several people stopped, but no one knew her name. I stayed until the ambulance arrived." Nathaniel remained silent. Emily continued softly. "When we reached the hospital, the nurses couldn't contact any family members. She was frightened and kept asking not to be left alone. I stayed with her until her grandson finally arrived." She paused briefly before adding, "The stain on my sleeve came from helping hold a towel against a cut on her arm after she fell. It wasn't serious, but she was bleeding enough to frighten herself." Nathaniel looked at the visitor bracelet without touching it. Everything Emily described sounded simple, almost ordinary. Yet every detail explained the unanswered questions that had occupied his thoughts throughout the night. "Why didn't you call the estate?" he asked quietly. Emily offered a small, apologetic smile. "My phone battery died while I was waiting in the emergency department. I borrowed a charger, but by then I realized how late it already was. I knew I had broken the rule." "You still could have explained when you returned." Emily shook her head gently. "The woman asked me not to discuss her situation. She was embarrassed that strangers had seen her collapse. I thought keeping my promise was more important than protecting my reputation." Nathaniel leaned back slowly. For the first time in years, he found himself unable to respond immediately. He had expected excuses. He had expected carelessness. Instead, he discovered quiet compassion that asked for no recognition. Emily had accepted criticism rather than break a promise made to someone she had met only hours earlier. "Is she all right?" The question escaped before he realized he had spoken it. Emily's expression softened. "Yes. Her grandson called me this morning. She was discharged before sunrise." A faint sense of relief settled over the room. Nathaniel looked toward the window, reflecting on the countless business meetings where people had exaggerated small sacrifices for praise or advantage. Emily had done the opposite. She had hidden an act of kindness even when it cost her personally. "You should have trusted me with the truth," he finally said. Emily answered honestly. "I wasn't sure I had earned that trust yet." Those words struck him harder than any accusation could have. For a brief moment, Nathaniel realized the distance between them had never been created by rank or status. It had been created by his own refusal to let anyone close enough to know the man behind the rules. As Emily quietly stood to leave, Nathaniel looked once more at the hospital bracelet resting on his desk. The anger that had consumed him the previous night had completely disappeared. In its place remained something infinitely more unsettling, a growing admiration for a woman whose greatest strength was not that she expected kindness from the world, but that she continued giving it even when no one was watching. The hardest goodbye is the one spoken by someone who believes they no longer belong. After leaving Nathaniel Brooks's office, Emily Carter expected life inside the Hawthorne Estate to return to normal. Instead, something subtle had changed. It was impossible to describe, yet impossible to ignore. Nathaniel still carried himself with the same calm authority. He still attended meetings, reviewed contracts, and maintained every household rule with unwavering discipline. But whenever Emily entered a room, his attention lingered for a fraction of a second longer than before. The staff noticed it almost immediately. The elderly groundskeeper smiled quietly when he discovered a brand new set of gardening gloves had been delivered to Emily after Nathaniel overheard her mentioning that her old pair had worn through. The kitchen manager found fresh ingredients arriving every Friday because Emily once commented that homemade soup reminded her of her late grandmother. Even the night security guards realized the eastern walkway had received brighter lighting only days after Emily nearly slipped there during a rainstorm. Nathaniel never admitted giving any of those instructions. He simply approved maintenance requests without explanation. Emily remained completely unaware of who stood behind the quiet changes. To her, the estate simply seemed to be becoming a warmer place. Nearly 2 weeks passed peacefully before another unexpected phone call arrived. This time it came during Emily's afternoon break. She stepped outside to answer, and the warmth gradually disappeared from her face. The elderly woman she had helped that rainy night had been admitted back to the hospital after complications related to her previous fall. Her grandson sounded exhausted. He apologized repeatedly for calling but admitted that his grandmother kept asking whether the young lady with the kind smile could visit again. Emily promised she would come after work. That evening she completed every assignment before quietly informing the head housekeeper that she needed to leave immediately after dinner. The request was approved without hesitation. She left through the east gate carrying a small paper bag filled with homemade soup, fresh fruit, and a handwritten get-well card. She never realized Nathaniel happened to be standing on the second-floor balcony overlooking the driveway as she departed. Hours later, Nathaniel remained inside his office pretending to review investment reports. The clock on the wall showed 9:30. Then 10:15. Then 10:40. He knew Emily still had plenty of time before midnight, yet he found himself glancing repeatedly toward the security monitor anyway. The realization frustrated him. He disliked depending on emotions he could neither predict nor control. At 11:40, rain clouds once again gathered over Dallas. Thunder rolled quietly across the sky while the first drops struck the mansion windows. Nathaniel stood and walked toward the glass without thinking. His reflection stared back at him, a man respected by thousands, feared by competitors, yet strangely unsettled by the whereabouts of one woman who worked in his household. He quietly asked himself a question he had avoided for weeks. Was he worried because she was an employee? Or because she had somehow become far more important than that? The answer frightened him more than he expected. 11:55 arrived. Nathaniel's heartbeat remained steady, but his attention never left the front gate. 5 minutes later, headlights slowly appeared through the rain. Emily stepped from a taxi carrying the now empty paper bag. She thanked the driver with a grateful smile before hurrying toward the entrance. Nathaniel watched until she disappeared safely inside the mansion. Only then did he release the breath he had unconsciously been holding. He almost smiled at his own reaction before forcing the expression away. Downstairs, Emily paused briefly beneath the covered entrance and looked back toward the rainy driveway. She had no idea someone had been waiting for her again. She simply whispered to herself, "I'm glad she's feeling better." At that exact moment, Nathaniel understood something he had spent years denying. The walls he had carefully built around his heart were no longer protecting him. They were imprisoning him. Yet just as he considered taking the first step toward changing, an envelope marked personal and confidential arrived on his desk the following morning. Inside was a formal employment offer addressed to Emily Carter from a charitable foundation in another state, offering her a position that would allow her to help vulnerable families full-time. Nathaniel stared at the letter in stunned silence. For the first time since Emily had entered his life, the possibility of losing her no longer felt like a distant fear. It suddenly became painfully real. Some people walk away because they stop loving you. Others walk away because they love you too much to become your burden. Nathaniel Brooks folded the employment offer with deliberate care, but his hands felt unusually heavy. Throughout his career he had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions, rescued failing companies, and outmaneuvered competitors who underestimated him. Yet a single envelope resting on his desk unsettled him more than any corporate crisis he had ever faced. The charitable foundation's offer was exceptional. It promised meaningful work, excellent benefits, and the opportunity for Emily Carter to dedicate her life to helping vulnerable families. It was exactly the kind of future she deserved. That realization should have made him happy. Instead, it filled the quiet office with a feeling he had never learned how to manage. Loss. Nathaniel spent the remainder of the morning trying to concentrate on business meetings, but every conversation blurred into background noise. During a presentation, one of his executives noticed he had reviewed the same financial page 3 times without commenting. Another quietly asked whether he was feeling unwell. Nathaniel dismissed the concern with his usual calm professionalism, yet even he recognized that his discipline was beginning to fail him. Meanwhile, Emily continued her work as though nothing had changed. She polished the library shelves, prepared fresh flowers for the dining room, and helped organize donations that the estate regularly delivered to local shelters. Her smile remained genuine, but there were moments when she paused briefly, staring through the windows as if quietly imagining another life beyond the estate gates. Late that afternoon, Nathaniel found her in the greenhouse carefully trimming wilted roses. Sunlight filtered through the glass ceiling, surrounding the room with a gentle golden glow. Emily looked up and smiled politely. "Good afternoon, Mr. Brooks." Nathaniel nodded before handing her the envelope. "This arrived yesterday." Emily accepted it with curiosity. The moment she recognized the foundation's logo, surprise filled her face. She slowly opened the letter and read every line in complete silence. When she reached the final paragraph, her eyes softened with quiet emotion. I wasn't expecting this," she whispered. Nathaniel studied her carefully. "Will you accept?" Emily did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked around the greenhouse, at the flowers she had cared for every week, the stone pathways she swept each morning, and the mansion that had become far more than a workplace. Finally she smiled sadly. "I don't know. The position seems important to you." "It is." "Then why hesitate?" Emily folded the letter and held it close. "Because leaving isn't only about accepting a new job." Nathaniel remained silent, sensing there was more she wished to say. "This estate became my home when I had nowhere else to go," she continued softly. "The people here became my family long before they realized it. Sometimes moving forward means saying goodbye to people who never knew how much they mattered." Her words lingered between them. Nathaniel wanted to tell her that she mattered more than she could possibly imagine. He wanted to admit that the mansion no longer felt alive unless she was somewhere inside it. But years of emotional restraint held every confession behind carefully locked walls. All he managed to say was, "Whatever decision you make, it should be based on your future, not your loyalty to this house." Emily looked at him with quiet gratitude. "Thank you." As she turned to leave, Nathaniel almost called her name again. The words reached his lips before disappearing. He watched her walk away until the greenhouse door gently closed behind her. That evening, the senior housekeeper entered Nathaniel's office carrying routine paperwork. Before leaving, she paused near the door. "So?" Nathaniel looked up. "Yes?" "Forgive me for speaking personally, but some opportunities disappear forever if we wait for perfect timing." Nathaniel frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" The housekeeper smiled kindly. "Miss Carter has spent years caring for everyone else without asking for anything. Sometimes the people who give the most quietly believe they can be replaced." She bowed respectfully and left without another word. Nathaniel remained alone in the silent office, replaying her sentence again and again. For the first time in his life, he understood that protecting his feelings by saying nothing might cost him the very person who had unknowingly changed his life. Across the estate, Emily stood alone outside the staff residence, looking up at the stars while holding the offer letter against her heart. She had already made a decision. She simply hadn't found the courage to tell Nathaniel Brooks that within 48 hours, she intended to leave Hawthorne Estate forever. There comes a moment when love stops asking for certainty and simply asks for courage. The morning Emily Carter planned to submit her resignation began like every other morning at Hawthorne Estate. She woke before sunrise, tied her hair neatly, ironed her uniform with careful precision, and prepared breakfast for the night security guards finishing their shift. No one looking at her would have guessed she had spent most of the night awake, staring at the folded employment offer resting on her bedside table. She had already signed the acceptance form. All that remained was telling the people she had quietly come to love that she was leaving. Across the estate, Nathaniel Brooks stood alone in his study, holding a cup of untouched coffee that had long since gone cold. He had barely slept. Every conversation from the previous afternoon replayed in his mind. The senior housekeeper's warning. Emily's hesitant smile. Her words about saying goodbye to people who never realized how much they mattered. For years Nathaniel had convinced himself that silence protected everyone. Now he understood that silence could also become its own kind of regret. Shortly after breakfast, Emily requested a brief meeting. Nathaniel looked up from his desk the moment she entered. She seemed unusually composed, but he recognized the quiet sadness hidden behind her gentle smile. "You wanted to see me?" he asked softly. Emily nodded and placed a neatly folded envelope on his desk. "This is my formal resignation." The room became impossibly still. Nathaniel stared at the envelope without opening it. Somehow seeing the single sheet of paper felt more final than the employment offer itself. "When?" he finally asked. 2 days from now," Emily answered. "I wanted to give everyone enough time to prepare." Nathaniel lowered his eyes. "Is your decision final?" Emily hesitated before speaking. The foundation helps families who have nowhere else to turn. It's meaningful work. I believe it's where I can do the most good. Every word was reasonable. Every reason was admirable. Yet none of them lessened the weight settling over Nathaniel's heart. "And Hawthorne Estate?" he asked quietly. Emily smiled with genuine affection. "This place gave me stability when I needed it most. I'll always be grateful." Nathaniel slowly stood and walked toward the large window overlooking the garden she had spent years caring for. Gratitude isn't the same as wanting to stay. Emily remained silent. She knew he was right. After several long moments, Nathaniel spoke again, though this time his voice carried none of the authority that usually defined him. "I've spent my life believing that keeping my distance was the safest way to protect the people around me." He paused. "I was wrong." Emily looked at him, surprised by the quiet honesty in his words. Nathaniel turned to face her fully. "The truth is, this house changed because of you. The employees smile more because of you. They help one another because you taught them how without ever asking for recognition." His eyes softened. "And somewhere along the way, I changed too." Emily felt her heartbeat quicken. She had never heard Nathaniel speak this openly. "Mr. Brooks," she whispered. He gently shook his head. "Not today." For the first time since they had met, he stepped away from the title that separated them. "Nathaniel." The single word seemed to erase years of carefully maintained distance. He continued before fear could silence him again. "I'm not asking you to stay because the estate needs you. It will continue without you." He drew a slow breath. "I'm asking because I don't know how to imagine my life here without you." Tears gathered quietly in Emily's eyes. She had imagined countless versions of this conversation, but never this one. Nathaniel reached into his desk drawer and removed the small wooden box she had never seen before. He placed it gently between them. Inside rested the thank you note, the pressed white flower, the faded ribbon, and dozens of tiny memories she had unknowingly left behind over the years. Emily covered her mouth in astonishment. "You kept all of these?" Nathaniel nodded with an embarrassed smile. "Apparently I started long before I admitted to myself why." Silence filled the office once more, but it no longer felt empty. It felt honest. Emily carefully closed the wooden box and looked at the resignation letter still resting on his desk. She realized she had arrived prepared to say goodbye. Instead, she had finally discovered the answer to the question she had quietly carried in her heart for years. Without saying another word, she reached for the envelope, gently took it back into her hands, and held it against her chest. Nathaniel watched her every movement, not daring to hope too much. Then Emily smiled through her tears and said the words he would remember for the rest of his life. "Before I decide where I'm going, I think we finally need to talk about where we belong. Home is not the place where someone gives you a room. It is the place where someone finally gives you their heart." The conversation in Nathaniel Brooks's office changed neither of them overnight, yet it changed everything that mattered. For the first time since Emily Carter arrived at Hawthorne Estate, there were no invisible walls separating employer and employee, only two people quietly learning how to speak honestly after years of silence. Nathaniel did not ask her to make an immediate decision, and Emily did not promise that she would stay. Instead, they agreed on something far more important. They would stop hiding behind assumptions. That afternoon they walked through the estate gardens together, not as a businessman inspecting his property or a maid completing her duties, but as two people sharing memories that had remained unspoken for far too long. Emily laughed softly as she admitted that she had secretly planted white roses near the eastern pathway because she believed every home deserved at least one place that reminded people to slow down. Nathaniel smiled and confessed that he had noticed the flowers years earlier but never realized she had planted them herself. They paused beside the old stone fountain where morning sunlight reflected across the water. "Do you know why I kept those little things?" Nathaniel asked quietly. Emily looked at him with curious eyes. He smiled with gentle embarrassment. "Because every one of them reminded me that kindness leaves traces long after the moment has passed. I simply didn't realize those traces were leading me toward you." Emily lowered her eyes, unable to hide the warmth spreading across her face. "I always thought you barely noticed me." Nathaniel let out a quiet laugh. "That may be the greatest misunderstanding of my life." For the next several days, the atmosphere throughout Hawthorne Estate became noticeably lighter. The employees sensed the difference without anyone explaining it. Nathaniel no longer walked through the halls carrying only authority. He greeted the staff by name, occasionally joined them for morning coffee, and even surprised the kitchen team by thanking them personally after dinner one evening. The senior housekeeper smiled every time she witnessed the quiet transformation. "The estate finally sounds like a home," she whispered to the elderly groundskeeper, who simply nodded in agreement. 2 mornings later, Emily requested one final meeting with Nathaniel. She carried the acceptance papers for the charitable foundation, along with her resignation letter. Nathaniel welcomed her into his office without saying a word. Emily carefully placed both documents on his desk. For a long moment she simply looked at them before smiling. "When I first received this offer, I believed I had to choose between helping strangers and staying where my heart already belonged." She gently lifted the employment papers. "Yesterday I called the foundation." Nathaniel listened quietly. "They asked whether I would consider serving as a volunteer advisor several weekends each month instead of relocating full-time." She smiled through grateful tears. "They accepted." Nathaniel looked at her, hardly daring to believe what he had heard. Emily slowly picked up the resignation letter, folded it once more, and tore it neatly in half before placing the pieces into the recycling basket beside his desk. "I'm staying," she whispered. Nathaniel closed his eyes briefly, overcome by a relief deeper than words could express. When he looked at her again, the guarded businessman who had once hidden behind rules had completely disappeared. "Then I have one promise to make," he said. "You'll never have to wonder again whether you matter here." Emily smiled gently. "I already know." Months passed, and Hawthorne Estate became known not for its wealth or influence, but for the warmth that filled its halls. Employees supported one another like family. Local charities received regular donations, many organized personally by Emily and quietly funded by Nathaniel. The elderly woman Emily had once helped visited the estate one spring afternoon with her grandson, carrying homemade pie and fresh flowers. She hugged Emily tightly before thanking Nathaniel for taking care of the young lady who never stopped taking care of everyone else. Standing together beneath the blooming white roses, Nathaniel reached for Emily's hand without hesitation. She smiled and intertwined her fingers with his, no longer afraid of where honesty had led them. The mansion that had once echoed with silence now carried laughter through every corridor. Nathaniel eventually understood that leadership was never measured by how many people obeyed him, but by how many people felt safe because of his presence. Emily realized that the family she had spent years searching for had quietly been growing around her all along. And together they discovered the simplest truth of all, that love is not built in grand moments or dramatic promises, but in countless quiet acts of kindness repeated every single day until one ordinary house becomes the only place either heart ever wishes to call home.